Makes Me Want to Holler by Nathan McCall. Chapter 29, Clashes. I knew from the get-go that the crossover into the white mainstream would be very risky. I knew I'd be extremely uncomfortable entering a world that had never welcomed me. But never, not in my wildest nightmares, did I imagine that going inside the system would make me an outsider, uneasy with folks I knew best. At first, I worked as a general assignment reporter, which meant that on any given day, I could be assigned to cover anything, from politics at City Hall to soft feature stories in obscure neighborhoods. My job exposed me to sides of Portsmouth that were once foreign to me. When I was hanging on the block, I couldn't name anybody on the city council or school board. As a reporter, I met them and learned all their names and most of their political agendas. Before, whenever I heard about decisions that affected the lives of blacks, I passively assumed they were irrevocable decisions made by faceless, powerful white folks who were out of reach. Now I got to see, firsthand, how the political process worked and how white citizens stormed City Hall when they wanted to get something done. Blacks in Portsmouth seemed light years away from understanding that process. They seldom organized and went to City Hall, mainly because they doubted it would make a difference. As a result, they were always reacting after the fact, always protesting after some historic black school had been closed or some right infringed upon, all because they hadn't been at City Hall when the deals went down. Subconsciously, I think I bought into a notion that whites promoted among blacks, that the white politicians who ran the city, though there was always a token black on the city council, were born with the knowledge and expertise to do such things. Then, as I began to cover the city I'd grown up in, it became clear to me that a lot of those folks were actually dumb as hell. Those were the same people who wanted to bring tourists downtown and whose infinite wisdom led them to build a new jail overlooking the Elizabeth River on prime waterfront property. In college, we were taught that the best journalists are objective, that they cover events while keeping their feelings and views removed from what they see. Most journalists, I believe, start out eager and green and stupid enough to believe that line. Then they quickly learn that the exact opposite is true. Journalists have feelings and opinions about everything. In my first year on the job, I ran into a lot of people and situations in the city that offended me and tested my restraint. Like the good white Christian man who called us out to write about his church's donation of food, clothing, and shelter to help a family of Laotian refugees get settled in America. When I interviewed him, he proudly displayed a house that he and his fellow church members had worked so hard to prepare for the foreigners. The house required so much work, he said, because the previous tenants were a trifling family that left the place a filthy mess. And it wasn't black people living in it either, he said, apparently realizing the color of the person he was talking to. He blushed. No harm meant by that. Then there was the white, pistol-toting landlord whose family owned a lot of low-income property in downtown Portsmouth, which they rented to black women on welfare. Every month, around the time when welfare checks were due, the landlord followed the mailman to the women's houses and cashed their checks on the spot to make sure they didn't spend the money before paying their rent. After cashing each check, the landlord took out his month's rent, then moved on to the next house. While he worked, an armed backup sat in the van nearby to guard against would-be robbers. When I interviewed the landlord, he said, "It's for the woman's convenience. They don't have to go anywhere else to cash the checks." When I was growing up, the Christian dude and the landlord were the kinds of white folks the fellas and I prayed to run across. Now that I found some, I couldn't act on what I felt. They call it professional restraint. I had to swallow hard and hold my peace. Any ex-con or former junkie will tell you that old homies get real suspicious of a guy who makes an abrupt shift from prison grade to suit and tie. Unless you've transformed into a cross-wearing, Bible-thumping witness for God, they start thinking that maybe you got a break by snitching to the man on somebody. Street paranoia can be hazardous to your health, and if you're not in a big city where you can fade into the woodwork, it can get seriously claustrophobic. It got that way for me after I started covering trials down at the Portsmouth Civic Center. When I was growing up, I was always going down there for one trial or another. I knew the Portsmouth Civic Center and its courtrooms front and back, but the instant I received that assignment, I knew it would create hassles for me. My primary job was to write about the newsworthy courtroom cases. It turned out that the most interesting cases were criminal trials, and of course, many featured cats I knew, like Jason, a young lion who grew up a few blocks from me. Riding around in the new Coupe de Ville, profiling like they all do when they got a piece of change, he openly flaunted his success at slinging dope. So it was no surprise when he was popped and promptly hit with a 10-year bid. Then there was Tony Rome, who served time with me at Southampton. He took an 80-year hit on a similar beef. I had to put the ink to both of them, and for the first time, I felt paranoid about my line of work. Often, while walking through the Portsmouth Court building, I run into old friends being led in shackles from one area to another. I tried to avoid them for fear they'd blow my cover among court employees or colleagues who didn't know my story. Then, one day, my past nearly caught up with me. I was walking through the building on my way to lunch with a court employee and ran into a group of shackled inmates being led to trial. One, a guy called Dickie, spotted me and shouted, "Hey Nate, how's it going? I heard you were out." I hadn't seen Dickie since I nearly OD'd at his place several years before. I had done several drugs at once, including acid and some herbs soaked in embalming fluid. Suddenly, I felt myself leaving, soaring past the stage of being high, shooting right on out the universe. Everybody abandoned me and left Dickie there to watch me die. Later, when I came to, I was stretched out on Dickie's raggedy couch, and he was sitting there, praying that I wouldn't OD and bring heat down on him. I hadn't seen or talked with Dickie since that night in 1974. I rushed over to him before he could blurt out more of my business, hoping my lunch companion hadn't heard what he said before. We chatted quietly a few moments, then he and the rest of the gang were led away. I don't know whether or not the court employee heard Dickie's reference to being out. He had been distracted by someone else passing through, but that brief encounter reminded me that my life was delicately balanced between two worlds and that inevitably my past and present would collide. That almost happened in the case of Chili Bear, another guy who had done time with me at Southampton. Bear was standing around talking near a dumpster in the Jeffrey Wilson public housing projects one day when two old heads from Cavalier Manor drove up. Armed to the teeth, they parked the car, got out, and split up among different sides of the street. Seeing the ambush coming, the target drew his piece and ran for cover. A gunfight broke out, with both sides shooting at each other like cowboys in a western movie. When the shooting ended, Chili Bear lay dead, caught in the crossfire. The case was big news in Portsmouth because Chili Bear had been a popular hood and one of the most heralded high school football linebackers to come out the city. When the trial started, thugs from Cavalier Manor in downtown crowded inside the courtroom to check it out. As I stepped in there to cover the trial, I could feel the eyes instantly riveted on me. I knew many of those cats, and I tried to decide, should I go over and sit with them, or should I keep a professional distance? I stayed away and sat quietly in the back of the courtroom near the door. During a recess, I went into the hallway to interview the prosecuting attorney. As we talked, fellas filed out and stood off among the walls, puffing cigarettes, talking, and eyeing us. I imagined how that scene must look to them. Nathan McCall, standing in the court building, dressed in a suit and tie, talking to a white man and writing stuff down on a piece of paper. I knew what they were thinking. I knew because I would have thought the same thing about someone else if I'd been hanging on the block. I tried to ignore the strange looks, but thinking about it made me feel uneasy. I wanted to go over and say, "Hey man, I ain't working for the law, man. I'm a reporter." But volunteering an explanation would have made the situation look more suspicious than it already did. Besides, I'm not sure they would have understood anyway. In their eyes, the newspaper and police were all the same, all part of that big, amorphous, antagonizing white world called the establishment, and now they view me as part of that. Nobody said anything to me, but after Chili Bear's trial, I heard through the wires that some bloods questioned how I had gotten out of prison and gotten squared away so fast. I imagine what some of them must have said. How that nigga gonna take a fall, come back, and get a better gig than most black folks who ain't never been locked up? It's hard to ignore talk like that. I considered going to one of my bosses to ask to be taken off the beat, but that would have involved revealing things about my personal life that were then off limits to them. So I lay low, waiting to see if there would be more serious fallout from my appearance at Chili Bear's trial. There was. I returned home from work one day and found a sealed note pasted to my front door. "Give up some money or I'm going to man on you." I understood the warped logic that led to that stupid act. Somebody assumed I hid in my past to get the job. I ignored the note and pushed on. Early in 1982, I ran into an old homie in Cavalier Manor while heading to my mother's house. He looked me up and down. "That's a nice looking trench coat you got on, Holmes. It makes you look like a lawman." He said it half jokingly, but I got the hint. I got hot around the collar and went off on him. "Fuck you, nigga." He grinned cynically and pushed up the street. That exchange brought my frustrations to a head. Reluctantly, I went to my editor and asked for another assignment. I didn't tell him the real reason. I said something career-oriented like, "I'm ready to take on another challenge." But I needed a change deeper than a single switch in assignments. I needed a complete change of scenery. I felt I needed to move to a city where I didn't have to confront my past every day. It was time to leave Portsmouth, and I decided that that was what I was going to do. As a reminder of my new goal, I posted a sign in big, bold letters on the wall, just above my bed. "I'm leaving by the fall, job or no job." It was frightening to think of leaving home. Besides prison, I've never lived anywhere else as an adult but Portsmouth. But I told myself I had to go. I had to go. Okay, that brings us to the end of chapter 29. And the thing I want you guys to remember is that most of the time, people can only understand up to their level of perception. You know, it's hard to perceive things outside our world of experience. And that's what Nathan McCall was going through with his old friends. You know, they couldn't see how somebody had turned their life around so drastically in what they saw as a short period of time. Most of the people that they knew, when they went to prison, they came out were doing a lot of the same things. But not Nathan McCall. He learned his lesson. He said, "Well, I don't want this anymore, so I know I'm going to have to do some things differently." And when you decide you want to do differently and do better for yourself, some people are going to have a problem with that. And I think that's mainly because they see you doing something better, and it's a direct reflection to them of, well, I could be doing that as well if I made some changes. But I don't want to make any changes. I want to stay in my comfort zone. And I want everybody else around me to stay in that comfort zone as well, so I don't feel like, I'm being left behind. So sometimes that takes, either finding a new friend group or a new peer group, or doing what Nathan McCall is thinking about doing, is moving to a new city. So what do you guys think? Look back on your own experiences and see when you've tried to make some changes and if people have treated you differently because of that. And that's not wrong. It's like, when you decide that you want something new, the universe is going to test that. It's either going to send a person, a situation, or an event that's going to really test your resolve to see, okay, do you really want this? And that's when you have to see it through. But anyway, thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Peace.